Hi everyone, it's Erin, and today I'll be trying to recreate this lovely Christmas card originally made by Ralph Hulett as part of a collection of cards he made in the 1950s for the Designers Showcase Company. This one's called A Bell in a Northeast Belfry Crusted with Snow. I just have a few colors here. I'll also be using cyan. I have my round head brushes in number 6, number 3. I'm using a wax palette, which is very handy, and I'm painting on illustration board. So I'm starting off mixing up the green color that's in the background, and I'm using yellow and black to create a very natural, or I shouldn't say natural because all greens are essentially natural, but this is more of a diminished sort of pea soup, or as I like to call it, exorcist green, which is a very warm green. It is a little too warm, so I do end up adding some cyan, but for now I've got these 3 values of this exorcist green. And I've made 3 values, a light, a medium, and a dark value, so that I can create the mottled effect that's happening in the background of this piece. Ralph was, I feel, good at a lot of things. I mean, he was great with composition, with colors, schemes, and all of that stuff, but I think his trademark was texture. After looking at all of the cards that he made for this collection, or all the ones that I could find, he really stands out as someone who is playing with a lot of different textures and creating some very interesting effects that I haven't seen anywhere else. I'll talk more about that in a minute. First, here is a technique. I'm going through the stages here. Number 1 was, if you have too much paint on your palette and you want to put some back in your tube, tap the paint down to the bottom of your tube, sort of tap your tube, shake it around, and then blow the air out, and then go down to the paint and suck it back up. I used to use just a little paintbrush to shove paint back in the tube, but then a viewer was like, no, do this method, and it does work better. So after adding some more cyan into the mix and a little bit more black, I have a cooler version of the color, closer to what it was in the original piece. And I'm continuing doing this modeling effect, some lighter areas, some darker areas. It creates a sense of movement, just visual interest, and yeah, I think it worked out pretty good. For the most part, well, Ralph used watercolor and gouache together, and that's something else that we'll touch on in a minute, but I first wanted to talk about the technique that I'm about to use. I'm sure many of you recognize this or have done this at some point in your lives, especially as kids. We would do this sort of splatter paint effect using a paintbrush and just getting the paint on the end of the brush and then flicking it. I love a good flick. This paintbrush I actually got in Japan from a hotel. I kept taking paint or toothbrushes from hotels. Remember that, Gina? This is they've come in handy. Now I'm using them for the splatter effect. As I'm painting these snowflakes, because that's what this splatter is representing, is snow, I realized some of the splatters were too long. They didn't really look like flakes, so I just went in and painted over those longer marks. And then I can go ahead and use my number 6 with a very fine point to continue making more just more obvious snowflakes, I guess. That splatter effect kind of gives depth to the flakes because some of the splatter is very fine. Sort of, when the wind blows snow, like freshly fallen snow, and the wind blows and you get these like smaller sort of flakes and crystals blowing through the air. So I think that's what the splatter feels like to me. And then these flakes are more defined, and some of them are bigger, some of them are more opaque, some of them are more transparent. And just that variety really gives, again, like a sense of movement throughout the piece. And I really hope it snows. It was supposed to snow today here in Vancouver. It's raining, which, that's okay. I do love the rain, but I'm ready for snow. And I don't drive. So for me, snow is nothing but pleasant. Do you all like snow? Let me know. Yeah, so here we go. Snowflakes are almost done. The next step will be painting with using this white, adding a bit more water I have to do a bit more of the modeling. So I think I added a little bit more yellow there. It looks slightly warmer because I noticed that behind the belfry, there is this yellowy, not yellowy, but a warmer area, which is lovely behind the red bell. It really helps that element pop out more. Okay, and just using my flathead brush here to do the roof of I'm guessing this is a church, it's a chapel with a belfry. And we're going to do a few coats of that white. So once it dries completely, I can go in again and just keep working. I think there's like 3 or 4 coats happening there to really get a nice flat opaque color. And now we're moving on to the tree. And as you can see, I put my canvas on its side so I could start the tree, and then I put it back to its regular orientation here. And yeah, just getting in that first coat. The white paint is more watered down here. I tend to water my gouache down a little bit more when I'm doing calligraphic lines or lines that go from thick to thin, more gestural lines. I want it to be more watered down so that I get a smooth shape, and then I can go ahead and do a second or third coat to make it more opaque. So again, watering down your gouache a little bit more just it gives it an ease of movement when you're painting these sort of details. And something I noticed, I've noticed it before when painting trees, especially Ivandurel trees, which these are very similar. They had a similar style, this mid-century style, which, also Mary Blair, so many artists, they all seem to work for Disney. They all have a similar way of stylizing trees and objects. And anyway, but what I noticed was that the trunk is wiggly, right? There's like these bumps as it goes up. And each one of those bumps is where you would then paint the next branch, which then branches off again. And I think it's just something to remember. If you want to draw some trees without reference, just draw a wiggly line for your trunk. And then from each bump or each wiggle, you just draw your branches. It's a good trick. And try to use a better brush than what I'm using. I've been singing the praises of this brush. It was great for a month or two. Well, no, more than that. I think I've been using this brush now for almost 6 months. But it's done. It's done. I should throw it away. This should be the last time you see me using it, but it probably will not be the last time. I'll probably keep using it until way past. It's definitely done. Anyway, try to use a nice number 2, number 3 brush. Number 6s are wonderful. I've mentioned this before, but it's really great to be able to use a number 6 that has a pointy tip so that you can load up that brush and you don't have to keep going back to your paint. You can load up the brush, but you also have a nice fine point to do these details. But how I'm doing it here is I'm really focusing on pressure. As always, less pressure will give you a finer line, and more pressure will give you a thicker line. And that's the story of the trees. I mentioned that Ralph Hulett, is that his name? Yes, it is. Oh my gosh. I mentioned that he had a similar style to Mary Blair and Ivandurel, and that they all worked at Disney. So I'll just give you a little bit of history about Ralph. He was born in Illinois in, I think, 1915. He died in 1974, which is the year I was born. And he moved to California when he was a teenager and went to Glendale High. And while he was there, it became very evident that he was extremely talented with watercolor and drawing. And he ended up getting a 4-year scholarship to the Chouinard Art Institute, which to me, I'm like, what a lucky guy. 4 years, like 4-year scholarship. That's amazing. So he went on to the Art Institute, and while he was there, while he was still a student, he ended up working for Disney part-time doing backgrounds for Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which is pretty cool. Just before I continue talking about Ralph, I'll say this is, of course, I'm doing the shadows of the bottom of the belfry, and this whole structure, I guess the belfry, the chapel, the roof, this whole thing, I really bung it up. Like I'm just gonna own it. I'm gonna embrace, or maybe not embrace, but just admit that I rushed this. I was not accurate, and this is one of those elements that I feel that I should have spent more time figuring out where things go, because when I'm finished, please don't rush to the end of the video. No, if you want to rush to the end of the video and see how much I kind of bung this up, but I really, it would have been smart to take a little more time and be a little more accurate, because it is a structure that is, I think, very recognizable, right? And so these mistakes that I end up making in proportion or in spacing really is the problem. They're obvious. They're more obvious than some of the mistakes I've made in other replicants. But anywho, take your time. If you end up replicating this piece, just when it comes to these posts, these beams, they turned out okay as far as the thickness of them, and you know, I can paint a pretty decent straight line. I always start very small and then work my way up to a bigger line as I perfect that shape, or as I try to perfect that shape. But when it came to the arches and the shadow in behind, I really should have started with the shadow behind the belfry and then painted the bell and then painted the beams in front of that. I should have worked the way I always do, which is from the very back moving forward. But I was distracted, I'm going to admit. Right now I'm pretty distracted. There's a lot going on. Christmas is coming, so I'm hosting a Christmas thing tonight with my lady friends. Actually, we used to call it Ladies Christmas. It's now called Bitches Christmas. And it's our 16th annual Bitches Christmas. So there's a lot going on. Anyway, I'm making excuses now for why this piece did not work out the way it should have. But I learned a lot from my mistakes, as I always do. And back to my story about Ralph. So let's stop talking about how I screwed this up. But he ended up working when he graduated, I think in 1938 it was, he ended up working for Disney, and he worked on everything. He was doing backgrounds for Pinocchio, Fantasia, Dumbo, Bambi, the Three Caballeros. And then in 1940 or around there, he started getting credit for, like, his name would be in the credits, and he did more work for Cinderella, Peter Pan, Lady and the Tramp, and so on and so forth. So he was very prolific at Disney. And then when he left Disney, he ended up doing a lot of commercial art, including these Christmas cards. We're now mixing the color for the roof. So this is a desaturated orange, essentially an orange brown. And so I'm just mixing together yellow and red and some black. And I do a test swatch here. Always a good idea to do test swatches. And I realized when I did this test swatch that it was too warm. It had too much yellow, so I'm adding more black and more red. And I'm keeping that lighter yellow hue for the front of the roof, so the part that's in the light. Right now I'm painting the part that's in shadow. And the colors aren't spot on. They're not exactly the way I want them to be, so I do adjust them. But I always make sure that I lay down a whole coat of the color that I'm using before I make an adjustment to that color. If you don't do a whole coat of one color and then you go ahead and do a second coat of another color, it will show, it will create an inconsistency. And if you don't want an inconsistency, if you want one color throughout and a nice flat color without any modeling, then it's a really good idea to do a whole coat of one color, then adjust your color, do a second coat, make sure the first coat dries completely, and then you can continue adjusting as you continue doing coats. So for this roof, I think I ended up doing 4 coats, and right there, oof, that line was bad. That line is sort of like, it's kind of got like a convex, it kind of bulges out instead of being concaved, instead of going inwards. And this is another example of how I rushed this piece and how this piece really deserved a little bit more care so that things would line up. The perspective, I guess, is quite off. And I think, if I'm really honest, I think that I rush objects like this because perspective is not my strong suit, and I'm just like, okay, whatever, and I just go for it. I kind of wing it. Not recommended. Although it doesn't, you know, again, it doesn't look terrible. I think I'll end up probably giving this piece to, you know, like a family member or something, because it's not that bad. Actually, if any of you want it, hey, here's a thing. If anybody watching this, if you've made it this far in the video, first of all, thank you. But second of all, if you want this piece, let me know in the comments below. You know, you can, we'll figure it out. We'll sort it out so that I'll send it to you. I'll even pay for postage. There you go. This can be a new thing for people who watch my videos to at least the halfway point. I don't even know if we're at the halfway point, but I will donate my piece to you. That sounded sexy, but you know what I mean. Okay, if you want this piece, let me know. Still working on the roof. Lots of coats to get that roof, and then doing the tiles, or not the tiles, sorry, the shingles. We're doing some shingle action. And here's where I'm using my 6 brush, but it's got this nice fine point on the end, and I can load it with lots of paint. I love a 6 brush. And this element was really fun for me to do. I felt very inspired by this snow encrusted chapel roof. Yeah, it's such a neat thing. I'd never really considered before how you would paint something that's encrusted with snow. And what really gives it that effect is, you'll see I end up doing sort of a shadow. Or not sort of a shadow, I actually paint a little bit of a shadow in around some of that snow. I also noticed when doing this that this part that I'm painting right now on the shadowed part of the chapel roof, or the top of the belfry, that part is quite dark. It actually, I'm going to do another coat over top of it with a darker gray. And we're just painting the little birds. So when I painted these birds, again, I was struck by the concept of painting shapes instead of the animal or object that you're. So in other words, I have a hard time painting animals or people. I get all caught up. I get intimidated. But the best way to approach it is to just paint shapes. And I say that in every video because it's true and it's really helpful. So a great exercise is, if you ever want to paint a landscape. I don't know if I've ever said this in a video, but if you ever want to go out and do a landscape painting, or if you're like on vacation somewhere really beautiful and you really want to capture the scene, just break everything down into simple shapes and start there. And it just makes everything easier. So here I am with my small brush doing the shadow that I talked about. And look at that. It really creates this sort of three-dimensionality with the snow that's encrusted on the roof. And it's such a simple effect, but it's very effective, I think. Yeah, love it. So now we're doing the bell, and the bell is not straight up red. It has a little bit of white in it. It's slightly higher in value. I put a tiny bit of gray in it to desaturate it, just a tiny bit. And it makes this really beautiful red. And this red is, on the color wheel, this red is almost directly right in the center of red, but it's a hair to the cool. So it's not an orange red. It's it is a true red with just a tiny bit of gray, a little bit of white. And I made a mistake. This should have been painted before I painted the white beams of the belfry. Like I don't know what I just wasn't thinking. I wasn't thinking. Because the shape would have been so much easier to paint had I not had to worry about these beams, right? These white beams. So trying to line things up after the fact, it messed me up. So the shape is not as accurate as I would have liked it to have been, but that's okay. It's cute. It kind of looks like a garden gnome's hat. Or it sort of reminds me of Pizza Hut, actually, which is a shape I love. I don't know about all of you, but I always wanted to live in a Pizza Hut. Like, if I could buy a Pizza Hut building and make that my home, or at least part of my home. I like weird shaped houses. Yeah, you can see I got some red paint on the white. Go figure. What a surprise. But yeah, lining it up was not ideal. Not ideal. But that's okay. I don't even know if I do a second coat. I think in this case I don't need a second coat. You know, red gouache, and I'm using acrylic gouache. Red gouache is just, it's so opaque. It's so vibrant that often you don't need a second coat, especially adding a little bit of white to it, which just adds more body. So I mentioned earlier that Ralph, I think I mentioned that he worked in watercolor. A lot of the backgrounds that he did were watercolor. And he also was part of the California Watercolor Society, which Mary Blair was also a member. And he had a lovely way of combining watercolor with gouache. And what the difference is between watercolor and gouache, I mean, there's a few differences, but one of the main differences is that watercolor has more pigment added to it, more pigment particles, but the particles in gouache are larger. So gouache is brighter. It's more opaque because there's also chalk added to it as well. But they both need water to be activated. They both can blend and bleed into each other, and there's a lot of similar qualities. But using both within one piece is really lovely, because you just get this nice variety of opacity and of saturation. And he seemed to be, I mean, he was really great at mixing the two and sort of using each to its best abilities. And here is where I really start to mess things up. This is where things get messy, but not in a great way. I feel like so many of these pieces that I do for this channel, messy is okay, being quick is okay, and I can get away with it. But this piece, I really should have dialed it in. Yeah. What can I say? I did not. And this whole part here, it's like hard for me to even watch myself doing it. Isn't that funny in life when you sort of look back at something and you're like, what are you doing? Don't do that. But I guess I learned a lot from my mistakes. I was just talking to a friend about how I'm kind of like ready at this point in my life to stop learning from like bad things or from mistakes, but start learning in a way that's, I guess, more positive, like learning from good things instead of bad things. Anyway, so this could have been done first before all of the white was painted. I guess my rationale for this was it would be difficult to paint white over top of this black shadowed area. So I did have some thinking. There were some thoughts happening here, but if you can see those little cutouts above, they're all squished over to the left. It looks ridiculous. And then this whole area in here, just, oh yeah. One mistake after another. But if anyone wants this piece, I'll send it to you. It's yours. It's yours for free. Speaking of which, I don't know, this isn't something that's free, but I am teaching online replicant courses. So I'm doing these kind of paintings with people on Zoom Sunday nights. It's a lot of fun. And the next round will be starting in January. So yeah, stay tuned for that. If you're really interested, if you'd like sort of an early bird warning about that, or be like the first to get a ticket for those, or reserve your spot, let me know in the comments below, and I'll reach out to you. I'll make sure that you're one of the first people to sign up. They're now starting to fill up. These classes are filling up, so it might be a good idea to jump on that early. Okay, so as much as I feel like I rushed this part and it doesn't look great, it is fun to see the black come into a piece and sort of how it can start to tie things in together. When I do these straight lines, so these posts, these straight lines, I do them in small strokes. I just sort of slowly, very delicately do these tiny little strokes, and I start very small, and then I can build from there and straighten them out. I mentioned that earlier, but I think it's worth mentioning again while I'm actually painting this part of it. And you can really see that technique happening there. Yeah, it's not too terrible. I wanted to also mention before I forget, this is, I mean, I don't know how important it is, but it's worth mentioning that, hold on, I'm going to turn my computer on to get the exact dates here. So Ralph Hulett, his Christmas cards will be on display from November 9th of this year to January 11th of 2025. His Christmas cards will be exhibited at the Hilbert Museum of California Art, which is at the Chapman University in California. Should go check it out. I wish I could check it out. It'd be very cool to see these in real life. I feel like I saw a lot of these as a kid, though. I feel like these cards were something that was around when I was growing up in the 70s. You know, these images are just very familiar to me. I mentioned that one of his trademarks, or what I think his trademark was, were textures, these background textures. I would love to be able to do a few more of these before the year is finished. I'll see how my time goes, but the textures that he made, I don't know how he did it. Some of them look like he painted, you know, bubble wrap or something. I don't know. When was bubble wrap invented? Must have been in the 50s. Anyway, it looked like he would paint surfaces and then stamp them onto his backgrounds, because some of his background textures are really unique. They don't look like sponges. I recommend going and checking out his work online and just seeing some of these incredible textures that he's getting that really just set his work apart. Because I was saying earlier that, you know, he's part of this mid-century style, and I'm assuming because they all work together, you know, he and Ivan Earl and Mary Blair, they were all at Disney around the same time, that, you know, they're learning from each other and they're borrowing each other's styles, and you know, all together, along with a lot of other artists, they were creating what we consider to be the mid-century style. You know, these abstracted shapes, dynamic compositions, you know, very interesting color combinations, minimal palettes, and very highly stylized objects, right? So out of that, though, each of those artists had their trademark. And I think with Ivan, it would be his trees. With Mary Blair, it was more her characters, like the people that she created and how stylized they were and how cute everything was. And then she also was really quite expressive with color combinations. She had this amazing eye for color. And then, yeah, Ralph was all about textures. But his work does feel, you know, like Ivan's and Mary's, and it's really my favorite, I think, of all the commercial art over the decades, the centuries, the time periods. My favorite is this mid-century style, because it's so dialed in. Everything's like, I feel like there's a lot of editing. Like there's things that they don't need to be there, are not there. There's not a lot of extra stuff, and what is there just has a lot of impact. This is the dry brush effect using a dry brush. There's not much to say. I always recommend doing a little practice area using a dry brush, dipped in paint, get the excess paint off, and then go for it. But that should have been done a long time ago. I should have done it before I did the posts. But anyway, enough of shouldas. Here we are at the end of the piece. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it all the way to the end, please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and I hope you all have wonderful holidays. Thank you so much. Bye.